Jackson remembers when the strip at 125th Street and Harlem River was a big mess of prostitutes and drug dealers, with a simple wooden fence and a few boulders the local kids would congregate on. He's glad that the area has been cleared of hooligans and made beautiful, but said that it's severely underused for such a pricey endeavor. A city is a machine with innumerable parts made by the accumulation of human gestures, a colossal organism forever dying and being born, an ongoing conflict between memory and erasure, a center for capital and for attacks on capital, a rapture, a misery, a mystery, a conspiracy, a destination and point of origin, a labyrinth in which some are lost and some find what they're looking for, an argument about how to live, and evidence that differences don't always have to be resolved, though they may grate and grind against each other for centuries. New York is a center that pulls people in and a centrifuge that spins them out into the world.
An upscale segregated nightclub, which catered specifically to an elite all-white clientele, the Cotton Club featured almost exclusively African-American performers. Langston Hughes said it was a, quote, Jim Crow club for gangsters and moneyed whites, end quote. Today's reincarnation opened in 1977.
Found in the regularly hidden in plain sight, politically engaged work, perhaps most often undertaken by feminists, queer theorists, disability activists, and subaltern peoples living under the thumb of a normativizing power that attends to the hard and fast materialities, as well as the fleeting and flowing ephemera of the daily and the workaday, of everyday and every night life, and of experience, understood in ways far more collective and external, rather than individual and interior, where persistent, repetitious practices of power can simultaneously provide a body, or better, collectivized bodies, with predicaments and potentials for realizing a world that subsists within and exceeds the horizons and boundaries of the norm. Causes tend to be known retroactively when they are known at all, traced back through multiple threads of effect, through volatile knots of human and inhuman actors operating in alliance as well as at odds with each other. When Jane Bennett maps the intricacies of the American power grid during a substantial blackout, no single intention or single actor or single failing can be found to trigger the spiral of effects that collapsed a network. Human is one among a wide many. No observer can even conceptualize this shifting mesh of power lines, generators, engineers, distribution nodes, consumers, conveyors, geographic expanses, appliances, managers, weather, and electrical flow in its entirety. There is no divine or objective perspective on a web within such deep relation. Agency is distributed among multifarious relation and not necessarily knowable in advance. Actions that unfold along the grid surprise and then confound. The agentism is a form of activism. Only in admitting that the inhuman is not ours to control, possesses desires and even will, can we apprehend the environment disanthropocentrically in a teetering mode that renders human centrality a problem rather than a starting point.
Showman's Jazz Club, originally located next door to the Apollo Theater, was a hangout for entertainers. In 1988, it moved to its present location, where the intimate space remains one of Harlem's premier jazz clubs. Over a famed bar, photos of a pantheon glow: Sarah Vaughan, Lionel Hampton, Pearl Bailey, Eartha Kitt, and Duke Ellington. The Magic Johnson Nineplex was a ray of hope for this neglected but improving low-income neighborhood when it opened in 2000. By 2008, the entrance area glass looked like it had never been cleaned, and half a block away, in front of the Apollo Theater, you could buy pirated DVDs of films currently playing from multiple vendors. America's most iconic cultural institutions, this theater was originally opened in 1913 as a whites-only burlesque theater. In 1934, after years of decline, it was reopened as the Apollo and began catering to the black population of Harlem. The Apollo's weekly amateur night gave rise to some of the most influential musicians today. The Victoria Theatre was designed in 1917 by Thomas W. Lamb, a notable and prolific theater architect of the area, for the Loews Corporation. It opened as a 2,394-seat luxury vaudeville and motion picture theater. It is currently under redevelopment to be a Marriott hotel and 191 apartments. Bloomstein's opened in the late 19th century and catered to a wealthy white Jewish population. By the 1920s, this famed department store had more black shoppers than white, but the employees were, with the exception of menial labor, all white. In 1934, the Citizens League for Fair Play plastered the streets of flyers that read, quote, "This film, acknowledging its large proportion of Negro business, has refused to employ Negro clerks. Stay out of Bloomstein's. Refuse to buy there," end quote. The first black clerks were hired a year later. The Orient Theater, located on 125th Street at Lenox Avenue, was opened prior to 1915 and closed around 1952. Likely a discount second-run movie theater, this building was demolished with apartments in its place today.
New York came to seem like a huge heart forever pumping an exceptionally fluid population in and out of the city. When your heart stops, you die. The city never stops, and New York in particularly is a non-stop metropolis, throbbing and rushing at all times of day and night. Major thoroughfares are sometimes called arteries, but if New York is a heart, all the modes of transportation are veins and arteries and capillaries, and its population the lifeblood.
Newly bought by an African-American businessman in the 1940s, the Teresa became a center of the social life of the black community of Harlem. The hotel profited from the refusal of prestigious hotels elsewhere in the city to accept black guests. As a result, black businessmen, performers, and athletes were thrown under the same roof. Housed in a historic commercial building, the Studio Museum is a contemporary art museum whose mission is to collect, preserve, and interpret the art of African Americans and the African diaspora. The museum is currently in the process of demolition and reconstructing the studio space.
Manhattan, a place whose population shifts and swings around the clock more dramatically than in almost any place on Earth. with millions pouring in and out by train, ferry, subway, and private car, influencing daytime workers and students, nighttime revelers, as well as one-time visitors, tourists, patients, and people coming for professional purposes. In addition to the daily cycle are out-migrations of the well-heeled to their country places every weekend, or to summer houses on Fire Island or Cape Cod, or in the Hamptons, or any of those other places whose names one knows whether one's visited them or not. And then there are the poor and not so poor who emigrate from around the world instead, and whose children do not go to camp, and who tend not to own country homes. The next generation often moves out to the suburbs, or used to. Housing economics now push poor and even working people to the periphery. One of the complicating factors for many cities is that the people who keep them running can't afford to live in them, and so they serve a city that does not serve them.
Now completely demolished, the Lenox Lounge was giving it up to jazz lovers since 1939 and was also a favorite haunt for Harlem Renaissance writers, James Baldwin and Langston Hughes among them. Recreations of the Lenox Lounge are often featured in music videos like Janet Jackson, Madonna, and P. Diddy.
The rezoning was a fraudulent and fraught process, said Michael Henry Adams, a writer and historian who has lived in Harlem for 30 years and vocally opposed the rezoning at the time. The lack of height limit and implementation of low floor area ratio kept the height limit to 6 stories. Now, the new height limit is 20 stories if you have a cultural facility on the lower floor. There are going to be all these facilities like a Black Harlem Heritage Disneyland. But where will the black people be? Gone. The spectrum is an unfinishable totality, an open expanse that gathers for a while a range of possible relations, always in excess of what a human perceives. No green Eden here, but a restless expanse of multi-hued contaminations, impurities, hybridity, monstrosity, contagion, interruption, hesitation, enmeshment, refraction, unexpected relations, and wonder. A swirl of colors, a torrent, a muddy river.
The Gotham Music Hall first opened in 1903, a time when Harlem was a predominantly affluent white section of uptown Manhattan. The hall, mainly used for plays and vaudeville, was originally the better part of a square block. It would probably be forgotten today except for the fact that in 1904, owners Sullivan and Cross hired a young architect named Thomas W. Lamb to do some minor alterations. It was Lamb's first theater-related commission, and he went on from there to become one of the masters. Mount Morris Bank was organized in December of 1880 when Harlem was being transformed from a suburb into an urban residential neighborhood, connected to downtown commercial and residential districts by the new Manhattan Railway Company lines. By the late 1970s, when properties were being abandoned all over the city, the corn exchange structure was vacant and remained mostly empty for 3 decades, vandalized and deteriorating. It was rebuilt in 2012 for commercial and retail occupancy.